The idea of postmodernism is to have narratives exist alongside each other. If you're just reading the same story over and over again, it may be a good story, but it's always going to be limited. What postmodernism is trying to do is show that, hey, there is no one grand narrative to any situation. The postmodernist is just trying to open room for interpretation.
How do you prevent yourself from overloading with too much information, too much nuance? When do you say it is enough?
There is always possible room, if not existent room, for another interpretation.
Okay, how much? How do you rectify?
So we are both from nations that benefited from colonial projects. The rectification is the necessary part, but the most difficult part.
But maybe that is where one of these meta-narratives, one of these big stories comes in. It seems to me that as humans, we are wired to gravitate towards big stories. And obvious examples there are religion and ideologies. So the French postmodern philosopher Jean-François Lyotard popularized the idea of big stories and called it also meta-narratives, and sometimes that's referred to as grand narratives. At the same time, postmodernism seems to be marked by skepticism towards big stories, while also rejecting the idea of absolute truths and objective knowledge. So, two questions to kick this off. First, could you give me the definition of what you think, or the technical definition of postmodernism? And with that in mind, if my summary just now about postmodernism is correct, how can postmodernism still lead to a meaningful life?
Yeah, I actually think your summary was pretty good. It's a rejection of grand narratives, but not necessarily for the reasons that everybody thinks. It's a rejection of grand narratives in that there are always other narratives. Famously and unfortunately in the United States, there was the historical narrative of Southern revisionism, which was this idea that the Confederates were the victims of an imperial North. And it was a narrative that tried to ignore, slavery, right? Just the actual reason for the Civil War. And so that's the concern that postmodernists have with grand narratives, the way that grand narratives can be used to push dangerous ideologies such as Southern revisionism or fascism.
Right.
And so what postmodernism is trying to do is show that, hey, there is no one grand narrative to any situation, that there are many narratives that occur. There are many things that are happening within a given historical context, different understandings. Yes, some may correspond more to reality, some less, but there isn't the possibility of an end-all be-all narrative. Mm-hmm. And when you have such a thing, it can lead to a lot of danger.
Right. So allow me to summarize your words back to you, just to make absolutely sure I'm clear on it. So when we talk about grand narratives, what we think are these big overarching narratives that are pretty much the absolute truth to our existence. And an example, and I'm not sure if this is true, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I think an example there might be the belief in God, any specific religion. And I think that what you're saying is that postmodernism doesn't necessarily say that the belief in God or one religion is the truth for humanity, but instead there's a nuance at play, and there's different stories that are coming together for people that, yeah.
No, you have it. You exactly have it. Yes, it's the interplay of rather there being one narrative, one story to rule them all. Mm-hmm. It's the fact that, hey, there are Buddhists, there are Christians, there are Muslims, there are agnostics, there are atheists, right? That all have these understandings, and that there are many instances where we can't figure out what is the end all be all, right? Now, postmodernists also have skepticism towards science, but in many ways, science is also a postmodern practice because it's not concerned with grand truth. It's concerned about workability and usability, right? A scientific theory is not a scientific fact,
Hmm.
right? What science tries to do is tries to ignore the Platonic, like, oh, we have the form of truth. Rather, instead, hey, right now, general relativity is the most usable practice for large-scale gravity, whereas before it was Newtonian physics. But, I mean, if you're driving your car, you're using Newtonian physics, you're not worried about bends in space-time. And so science in of itself is a postmodern practice. So it is kind of funny that there are conflicts between scientists and postmodernists, and I think a lot of that comes from neither understanding the other's mission. Both have the common mission of essentially giving a middle finger to Plato and being like, look, let's not worry about objective truth. Like, there may or may not be one, but at the end of the day, the thing that makes better sense to do is use different narratives in their appropriate context, right? Rather than being concerned about one narrative that doesn't cover everything, right?
Hmm.
If you are talking about, let's say, working on someone's feelings, right? If you're a psychologist, psychoanalyst, social worker, etc., right? You could bust out Lacan, you could bust out theory, or you could just bust out emotional empathy, right? It depends on the time and place, right? There is no grand truth of, aha, our psychology is entirely rational or
Right.
it's
Yeah.
entirely emotive. There's multiple narratives, contradictions, occurrences going on at once that both may have their sense of truth in them.
Right. Yeah. And you mentioned that there's a friction between postmodernism and between science. And do I have it correct that that's friction primarily comes from the idea that science is the pursuit of absolute truth. So they're trying to find what absolute truth is. They're trying to map reality, let's say. While postmodernism says that is the wrong aim because we should instead of trying to focus on what absolute truth is, we can spend our time better on trying to identify the different stories that are the different elements that are relevant in human lives, and therefore do something with those. Is that the correct analysis there?
In some sense, yes. In some sense, no. So science is not in pursuit of a grand truth, right? It's not worried about truth. It's worried about workability, right? When we're talking about a unified theory of physics, we're talking about like the most usable thing. That theory of everything is not literally going to cover everything, right? It just has a big fancy pop science title. Ultimately, it's trying to find a more usable, workable definition of gravity or understanding of gravity that works at the quantum and the large scale levels. And so science is not this thing as much as it gets framed as the truth, right? This whole sort of notion of trust the science is misfounded, right? I know the people who are trust the science people have really good intentions, and I say this as a general lefty person myself. So that understanding, though, is not the case. But the part that you're talking about with the postmodern thing about like, okay, let's focus on this narrative, this thing. Yeah, scientists do the same thing, right? You'll have, biologists that are hyper specialized on a specific species of spider. You'll have scientists that are hyper focused on a particular molecule, right? And so postmodernists and scientists are, in some sense, finding workability just in very different fields and under very different methodologies. Scientists are obviously very data-driven, experiment-driven, whereas postmodernists are very much immersed in literature and language and sort of psychology, right? And so I think the conflict is misunderstood by both parties because they are specializing in two very different things. You have the scientists specializing in, material, grounded, experimental data, whereas the postmodernists, by and large, are big fans of literature and psychology and fields that aren't as experimentally grounded per se.
How can you reconcile these two? And in your opinion, should they be reconciled together?
Yeah, I think 100%, because I think ultimately postmodernism is not a time period, it is a tactic, right?
Hmm.
That postmodernism is a tactic of not falling into a grand narrative. And this is something I think everyone can benefit from, right? Benefit from a double checking, benefit from not falling into a grand narrative. You'll oftentimes see scientists sort of lose their luster when they fall into a grand narrative and, lose that search, lose that, finding of new answers. And so when we treat our world as one full of narratives rather than a narrative, right? If you're stuck in a narrative, if you're just reading the same story over and over again, it may be a good story. It may be an accurate story. It may correspond to reality, but it's always going to be limited. And so, yeah, I think if we think about postmodernism as a tactic of exploration, of hermeneutics, of interpretation, then these things can be easily reconciled if we think about things being postmodern rather than postmodernism being isolated from like any other occurrence, right? You can have
Mm-hmm.
postmodern literary studies, as a scientific mentality, as a political mentality, so on and so forth of, this sort.
Maybe this is a very silly. This is probably a very silly question, but when we are discussing the idea of grand narratives, what are generally the grand narratives that come forward, or that postmodernism, as a way of approaching the world, has the most friction with? Is that indeed things like religion, or would you say that there's other what? So pretty much what I'm asking you is, what are the big areas of conflict is maybe a heavy word, but the big areas of friction with postmodernism and the large narratives.
If you want an example of a particular narrative, I think fascism is a very clear example because fascism points towards a quote unquote truth of hyper-nationalism by any means necessary. And this is very much against the anti-grand narratives, right? Fascists are very fond of grand narratives. But I mean, postmodernism is a general dispute with grand narratives in general, a dispute with end all be all interpretations. It's the view that all end all be all interpretations can be dangerous for various reasons. Some are like dangerous in the fascist sense, where they will target trans people, people with disabilities, Jews, whoever is the target group for said fascist regime. But they can also be dangerous in the sense in that they can stop exploration, that they can stop investigation, that they can stop progress and interest. This isn't to say that there aren't quote unquote superior narratives or aren't narratives that better correspond to reality, right? Like we can just, for various reasons see that the earth is not flat.
Hmm.
But that doesn't end people thinking this way, right? We could, be like, no, this is the fact, this is the fact. But unfortunately, one of the things that I think postmodernists are very good at is pointing out, hey, we're not robots, we're not like raw seers of data, right? Our facts do care about our feelings. They always have. And you can see this in a lot of the people who, shout, oh, facts don't care about your feelings, are some of the most feelings-based individuals. And we should just accept that. We should accept that, hey, we are limited in our senses. We are, feelings-based creatures, right? Our investigations aren't like raw, absolute truth investigations. They are always investigations from a perspective. Some correspond to reality better than others, but nonetheless, they are always perspectival.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not sure where I got this from. I think it was a podcast of Andrew Huberman that you just brought to mind when you said that people can't operate. Um, that people are feeling based pretty much, and the idea that came to mind that was in that specific podcast, I believe, was that there's an area in the brain where the things like emotions and feelings and that comes from. And if you manage to disable that, so let's say you can turn that part of your brain off, right? You don't feel any emotion, you don't have any feelings and that kind of stuff anymore, that inhibits decision process, which then will be the factual action, right? So that gives a very technical input to the idea that without emotion and without feelings, literal factual decision making is not possible.
Yes, yeah, Nietzsche talks about this too, who's, I would argue, the true father of psychoanalysis, that like we aren't devoid of feelings in our decision making. Like
Hmm.
we are under what can be referred to as mind-body monism, that like the mind, our thinking processes are part of our embodied process. We necessitate bodies and feelings in order to think out of happenstance, right?
Yeah,
Nietzsche isn't trying to say, oh, this is just a Platonic truth. He's just saying this is just how things seem to correspond, right? Like
yeah,
your understanding of reality is based upon the languages you have come to learn, happens to be from, the family you were born into, the nation you were born into, the books that you've, had access to or chosen to access, right? Like these thoughts and understandings, facts and truths and feelings and all this sort of stuff comes from phenomenological experience, comes from that first person perspective. And I think a lot of people try to detach our first person perspective from data as if there is just like nebulous free floating data free from people with biases, perspectives, feelings, facts, backgrounds, lived experiences, etc., of that sort. And this is one of the reasons why postmodernism is anti-grand narrative, because how could there be a narrative that is befitting of all people's experiences, of all people's occurrence, right? And in that sort of sense, right, maybe there are times where this may be inappropriate, right? Like maybe there are certain just objective truths, such as like existence is a thing, right? I think that one is pretty hard to argue against. But by and large, a lot more within our reality does fall into postmodern tendencies. We want to make everything an objective truth, but hey, there may be instances where objective truth exists alongside non-objective truth tendencies, narratives, etc., of that sort.
okay. Let me try to put this together because there's a very specific question that one of the listeners brought forward in preparation to this conversation, and I think it ties in there. But allow me a little bit to properly formulate that. What you said in the beginning of the conversation is that postmodernism concerns itself with not necessarily the grand narratives, but with I'm not sure if lower level is the right word, but with the individual stories, right, and how they work together, to try to figure out what's important for humans and what we should focus on. You also mentioned that postmodernism is not necessarily something of this time, but that it concerns itself with historical context and also with, the times, let's say, if I got that correct. So far, is there anything wrong?
Well, I would put it like this. Bruno Latour has a book called We Were Never Modern. And this was a big inspiration for my own thinking and admittedly my unorthodox thinking around postmodernism as not belonging to a time period, but as a method or a tactic of understanding history, literature, etc., right? So we can think of modernism as a frame of thought. We can think of, ancient thought, postmodern thought, right? Like, yes, you could still be ancient in your thinking. You could still be modern or late modern in your thinking. It could be postmodern in your thinking. A really good example of an ancient postmodern thinker is the Taoist philosopher Zhuangzi. If you read the works of Zhuangzi, he is extremely postmodern in his thinking. There's a lot of stuff in Zhuangzi that, is found in Nietzsche or Foucault, even on criminality. And so, yeah, I think postmodernism is a means of looking at stuff. It's not like, aha, in 1947, postmodernism appeared. No, it's been something that's been a part of human philosophical thought. It just didn't have its sort of name until Lyotard. And really, it kind of boosted in popularity, yes, in a certain time period, but it's not like the postmodern thinkers were drawing from nothing, right? They were drawing from Nietzsche by and large, and even if they weren't drawing from Zhuangzi, that sort of thought existed out there and influenced a lot of, Taoist thought that, very much has a lot of similarities to postmodern thinking at times.
Gotcha. Okay, so it's a way of thinking about, so it's a tactic to approach a specific moment in time and to review that moment in time to decide whether what happened then was moral or not moral, and how we should look at that, how we should interpret that.
Not necessarily. It could be used for that. Like Foucault is famous for this when he's looking at the history of sexuality or the history of criminality. What Foucault is trying to do is ignore in criminality the grand narrative that like the criminal equals bad, right? That we have this association with like an image of a criminal in the orange jumpsuit, always being bad, yada yada. Instead, what Foucault did was look at narratives to paint a different picture of the history of criminality, to investigate criminality through more individualized narratives rather than just go, aha, big narrative, criminal equals bad. And what Foucault discovers is that our definition and understanding of the criminal has changed dramatically over time, right? It used to be more punitive, more physical, and now it is more psychological and soul recovery based, right? To summarize, his thoughts on criminality very quickly. And so we can do this with postmodernism again and again. What it more so often does is it will take, something, right, that is assumed to be the case and go, hey, actually, what about this narrative? Hey, what about this narrative? What about this narrative? Sometimes it could be a larger sort of thought throughout history. Let's just say, the history of criminality, to keep running with that example. Or it could be about a particular historic event. Let's use like the Roman Empire, right? Where it's like, oh, why did the Roman Empire fall? People will typically cite like one or two reasons. But if you actually look at the history of the Roman Empire, there was like 60 different things going on that led to the long decline of that empire, right? So it's trying to avoid, in some sense, also the oversimplification of history that, our understanding of the criminal now, our understanding of the Roman Empire now has always been the case. It goes, hey, no, wait, but there's these other alternative ways of thinking about this, about this, about this, about this, and so on.
So if we make this practical for simply Bob and Sarah, just regular working class people at home listening to this conversation right now, and let's approach this first from from maybe a religious perspective. So let's say that Bob and Sarah, they're both Christians, they're maybe a bit conservative, and they believe that that is the truth that people optimally that is okay. Let me rephrase that. That is the framework through which people can optimally approach the world. What you just laid out, how would you recommend Bob and Sarah in this case? So what advice could you give Bob and Sarah about postmodernism? What does it mean for them? What specific tactics or elements of this can they use in order to maybe widen their scope or approach the world in a different way?
Yeah, I think ultimately, people holding on to narratives is just not a bad thing, right? I think there's that misunderstanding of postmodernism is anti-narrative in general.
Right.
The stance of postmodernism, more so as I understand it, is not anti-narrative. It is anti-one narrative stepping upon any other. The problematic thing is not religiosity. I teach at a Catholic institution. I've taught in religious studies. I have a great respect for religion. The issue at hand, though, is when one religion blots out another, when one political ideology blots out another, when one interpretation blots out another. The idea of postmodernism is to have narratives exist alongside each other and then allow individuals to investigate, which ones correspond more so to reality, or like, hey, maybe there's like elements of each that are it very much is dependent. But the postmodernist is just trying to open room for interpretation, right? That doesn't mean anyone has to personally take it on, right? If you are religious and, you are believing in that and satisfied and, all those things, who am I to say, how dare you, right? The concern then is, though, are you using your religiosity as a bludgeon, as a weapon? Are you using your politics? Are you using even like your review of like Detective Pikachu, right? Like, I have the best interpretation of Detective Pikachu. Like, no,
Hmm.
like these things, don't need to be end all be all, right? You can have your understanding based off your preferences, feelings, backgrounds, etc. of the sort. The postmodern sort of ask is to go, hey, don't have your interpretation be used as a weapon to shut down other interpretations, full
Right.
stop. Right. There is still room to argue that, like, hey, the earth isn't flat. Like, we have all this evidence. Like, this is, so there is room for argumentation, but not like, bludgeoning, right? It's a very fine line, but it is an important line that postmodernism advocates for.
I think from the two perspectives that you're bringing forward, it makes a lot of sense. So the idea of don't just believe that there's one truth and then block everything else out, or even worse, actively fight it, that makes perfect sense, right? 100%. The other thing I'm wondering though, it's kind of the other side of the extreme, is there are things that are objectively true. And you mentioned, for example, the world is round, it's not flat, and that's pretty objectively true. So we know that, so we can live by that standard. What I'm curious about, and let me know what you think about this.
Hmm.
To me, it seems, and this is my personal feeling that I'm sharing right now. To me, it seems that humans in general, they, for whatever reason, they tend to gravitate towards finding the truth, the one truth. And I think that goes deeper than ideology, deeper than just things that we hear from others. I think, to me, it seems like kind of like a primal instinct that we are trying to find what is the actual truth. And it also seems to me that the closest thing that we have come is religion to some degree. And then you can ask yourself the question, like, okay, what kind of religion is that then, right? Is it religion in general, or is it a very specific branch of religion? What is it then? But that seems to be one end of the spectrum, and another end of the spectrum is science. It's like these two forces, right? Religion and science that are also in conflict with each other to some degree. One is saying that they are the truth, I think, and one is saying that they are trying to map the truth, or they are at least trying to understand reality. So the question I'm kind of repeating the same question, but the question I'm going for with this is if that feeling is correct, that people in general are gravitating towards the story, right? The grand narrative. But we should instead focus our view on trying to find the stories that are out there that are important to humans and that we should care about. But that at the same time, we have the individual freedom. So just like you and me right now, we have the individual freedom to decide. I'm not sure if it's to decide or just to know, but anyway, to decide what we believe and what we don't. So there's therefore an inherent conflict between each and every single human's beliefs. So how do we find common ground?
Well, we do it all the time. I would argue that, like, our condition has always been postmodern to a degree.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's always been, conspiracy. I mean, just read Herodotus, for example, right? And all the mythos there. And so in that sort of regard, like, we just do find common ground, right? There are enough people convinced by the very strong evidence that the earth is round. The issue here about narrative is not whether, again, narratives are more or less accurate, right? Because that is the case, and we should run with those more accurate narratives. It's just along the lines of that one narrative doesn't conditionally end room for interpretation. It doesn't matter how many moon landings, how many photos of the
Right.
earth, how many
Mm-hmm.
people go into space, right? Until there is a, condition of like, where there is no room for interpretation in a different direction, which I don't think is possible, right? At the end of the day, there's always room for the possibility of a different interpretation. Even if 100% of humans agree that they exist, which again, it's not 100%, even if 100% of humans agree that the earth is round, which that one certainly does not exist, right? There's still room for more interpretation. Emmanuel Levinas points to this idea of a hermeneutics of violence, where an end-all be-all interpretation acts as a bludgeon. But again, it doesn't even seem that there is the possibility of an end-all be-all interpretation.
Mhm.
It seems that we are more in a hermeneutics of pacifism, in that there is always possible room, if not existent room, for another interpretation. And so we see in our just lives, people gathering around all sorts of narratives, be they grand, be they minor, right? People gathering around religious narratives, political narratives, their love of particular video games, right? Like I'm a Pokemon nerd, so I gather with fellow Pokemon, people for example. I'm a big fan of the NBA. I'm a Heat fan, right? Like that's my own sort of narrative, right? It's not objective that the Heat is the best team ever, right? That is my narrative that, being a South Florida guy, I love the Miami Heat. So yes, I think to answer your question in the sense of that, like the postmodern condition that we are in creates room for both collaboration and for, yes, competing sort of narratives, right? That's where we are at. So we find this sort of tribalism that can occur, or not even necessarily always tribalism, but grouping up based around particular narratives. But again, our groups are limited in part because our narratives are limited. Not everyone's American, not everyone's Republican, not everyone's a Pokemon fan, a fan of the Heat, etc. of the sort.
And how do you prevent overloading yourself? So if you're trying to make a decision about whatever that is meaningful to you, how do you how do you prevent yourself from overloading with too much information, too much nuance? When do you say it is enough? Now I know what the truth is on this specific thing.
Well, I think the prevention of overload is different from stopping at the truth, right? Which might sound strange, but the stopping at the truth, I don't think should ever be the case, right? I'm personally of the lines of like, this is the best information we have right now. And I think in that, though, right, we can take little breaks, or we can basically, limit what we want to investigate. There's a quote that is surprisingly in the Analects of Confucius, which is very un-Confucian, which is take what is good and leave out the rest. And in that sense, like that quote is very subjective from a very like, meaningly to be objective sort of text. But there is something in that, right? If your interests are in investigating literature or psychology, go ham on that. If your interests are in, the particular arachnid in New Mexico, let's say, do that, right? And so the prevention of overload could in part be, gravitating towards your natural interest, towards your natural joys, right? I'm not going to force myself to watch a baseball game on TV. I don't need to know everything about baseball. I have no interest in that particular sport. No offense to baseball people, because again, they like that sort of stuff, right? And someone may look at me in return and go, really? Basketball? Like that's your thing? And so, yeah, the prevention of overload is to follow those sorts of narratives you're interested in. When you have a grand narrative, that may be the overloading situation because you need to make everything work in that grand narrative. This is why fascists, for example, contradict themselves so much, because they try to make so many competing things and things that don't align work in their narrative. Oh, we're empathetic, but we're also going to deport a bunch of people. Oh, we care about the nation, but also, here we are, murdering and imprisoning members of our nation. And so it's actually, weirdly enough, trying to make everything fit into a grand narrative instead of being like, oh, that's some interesting stuff about computer programming. Oh, that's some interesting stuff about this. Oh, right. The overload, I think, comes from when you're trying to cram too much in a small box, whereas postmodernism allows for the, in Taoist terms, the usefulness of emptiness, right? It creates an ever expanding, room of like, just a void of stuff like, oh, I'm gonna put this here, I can put this here, I can put this here if you want to, rather than making everything fit into a particular predefined space.
Let's talk about fascism because you brought it forward a couple of times already. So you said that fascists are fond of grand narratives and they are also fond of targeting specific groups and that they stop progress and interests. Let's get the definition down. What is fascism? Because it seems like one of these words, right, that everybody nowadays is using. There's a couple of these words like toxic and like narcissism, those kind of words. Everybody uses them, but it feels like there's very little understanding of what it actually means. So can you give me the definition of what fascism actually is?
Yeah, for sure. Fascism is not just like, anything that the left hates. Yes, there are people who use it like that, but in a technical sense, and this is through Mussolini's The Doctrine of Fascism, right? Like in the words of the ideological inventor of fascism, fascism can be defined as hyper-nationalism by any means necessary. Sometimes it's referred to ultra-nationalism, but the image is nonetheless the same. It's like hyper-nationalism at all costs.
Right. Okay. And nationalism, to get the definitions down, is a love for your country, or would you give that a more broad? Would you give that a more specific definition?
Nationalism can exist in different understandings, right? We can have something like white nationalism, where you want your nation state to comprise of a particular identity. So there isn't as much of a universal definition of nationalism, right? Some people can refer to it more casually as, oh, I love my country. And so that can conflate nationalism and patriotism. But in this context, nationalism, in a sense, means sort of the putting of energies into your own country above the rest. So a non-hyper nationalist, right, a normal nationalist cares about their country's interest, above the rest of the world. So nationalism in this sense would be opposed to cosmopolitanism and globalism and internationalism, where you would want the interests of the globe, the world, the cosmos to be above, just everything else. Whereas the nationalist wants to put their interests, their nation above all others.
Right.
However, a normal nationalist isn't going to do that by any means necessary, right? Like a normal nationalist isn't going to put their nation's interests above all others by any means necessary. Whereas a hyper-nationalist will.
Right.
Any and all methods are, on the table. Mussolini talks towards the end of The Doctrine of Fascism how both imperialism and non-imperialism are both valid methods towards hyper-nationalism.
Okay. So what then is the difference between fascism and between Nazism? Is that just a form of fascism, or?
Nazism is not like the only form of fascism, right? It wasn't even the first fascist instantiation. The first instantiation of like an ideologically organized fascism was under Benito Mussolini. There are regimes such as like the regime of Napoleon III in France that were proto-fascistic. The reason his regime is proto-fascistic is because Napoleon III used basically all the tactics, all the methods, all the sort of methodologies of fascists, but he did so before nation states were like as fully recognized, right? So the nation was a thing, but not enough for him to be fascistic about it. By the time you get to Mussolini, right, there is national consciousness to enough of a level to have hyper-nationalists. And so Benito Mussolini is an instantiation of this. Hitler's an instantiation. Francisco Franco, Batista in Cuba. These are, examples that come in various forms. And I would certainly argue in the present sense that Donald Trump is another instantiation of fascism.
Why do you think that?
Why do I think that Trump is another instantiation? Well, because if we look at the rhetoric, if we look at the actions, they are hyper-nationalists, right? The America first, rhetoric and mentality, and that willingness to, use all the tools and weapons that America has against others,
Hmm.
right? And so one of the things that he has done is withdraw aid, right? Not that USA aid was perfect. However, right, it helped feed, millions of people in India. It helped out with HIV medication. So it's like, we're going to withdraw, our goods from you to make our nation, stronger in comparison, right? The threats to invade Greenland, the threats to invade the Panama Canal, the Gaza Strip, right? These are multiple types of tactics to put one nation ahead of others, right? To use tariffs as a tool to crash the global economy. Like, hey, we'll all sink together and we're just going to hope that the United States comes out on top in comparison.
Hmm.
And I mean, I could keep, citing reasons, but and we can get into more, but I think it's pretty clear under the scholarly and technical definitions, pretty much the vast majority of them, that Trump, falls into that realm of fascism and has crossed the fascist Rubicon for some time now. We don't need to put an exact amount of time on this, but that Rubicon of fascism has been crossed in the American context.
Let me see if I can phrase this question correctly. What you're saying is very, very interesting. And I think I can see what you mean there. But with that in mind, why do you think so? Okay, so from your perspective, why do you think the support for Donald Trump is so large within the United States? So I'm asking that from an outsider's perspective.
Yeah.
So for everybody who's listening and for you as well, I'm in Netherlands, which is Western Europe. So I'm looking at this from an outsider's perspective. But what I'm seeing is a president who had a tremendous amount of support. Also, obviously, a tremendous amount of what's the opposite of support?
Dissent.
Yeah, but with what you just said in mind, why would he have that much support?
Well, I mean, there's a variety of reasons, but the main one that I, just noticed is
Hmm.
the difference between, blatant sort of statements of concern about material conditions versus kind of like bureaucratic jargon. What do I mean by this? When we look at how the Democratic Party pointed to like people's material conditions, they talked about like tax credits and, tax cuts that were very technical and bureaucratic and, just weren't, the clearest to the average American, including myself. Whereas Donald Trump just went groceries. I'm going to make groceries cheap. I'm just going to lower the price of stuff.
Hmm.
What's a more appealing narrative? The weird bureaucratic tax credits, which are like technically good and workable and good and sensible policy, or the guy who says, I'm going to fix it. You're going to go with the I'm going to fix it guy. Yes, there are people out there who vote for him out of, racism. There are people who vote for him out of anti-immigration sentiment. But a lot of that anti-immigration sentiment is also an economic concern, right? They'll look at people that I'm very close with in my own life and be like, that immigrant is a thief. They're taking from me, right? So the immigration concern is an economic concern. So Trump, in pretty much multiple senses, won on material conditions. By pointing at immigrants, he's pointing at, look at these people who are robbing from you. While this isn't statistically happening, this is what he's saying. Look at these trans people and this, culture stuff, right? Trying to say that the culture is robbing from you. A good example of this is him talking about how Beyonce was paid $11 million to endorse the DNC, which she wasn't. But again, like, look at these cultural thieves, be they trans, be they celebrities. And then last but not least, right, just flat out saying groceries and, lowering egg prices and stuff like that. So that's Trump's popularity.
Hmm.
It's that Americans in the developed world, have massive gaps in wealth equality. There's a lot of material concern in the United States. Amongst the developed world, we have, I think, the highest rates of homelessness, right? We have one of the biggest wealth gaps, right? I mean, you'll go to parts of the United States and just see a lot of economic woe, which is only, further worsened by the fact that our healthcare system is not a guaranteed system for citizenry, leading to a lot of medical debt, right? There's a lot of student debt, right? A lot of credit card debt. Like there's a lot of personal economic problems despite being in the wealthiest country in the world. And Trump acts as a sort of figurehead, despite being an elitist billionaire himself, of being like, I'm going to fix your problems. I'm going to go after those people who have stolen from you.
Okay, there's a whole bunch there that we can go into, and I don't intend to make this a conversation primarily about Trump, but there are a couple of things that I would point out, or not point out here, but that I would ask for.
Mm-hmm.
And this is once again from an outsider's perspective. Okay, before a bigger question, the immigration policy was a pretty big one, I think, in the whole Trump campaign. And you just mentioned that you have a personal circle as well that Trump and his cabinet and his party would point at right now and say like, "Hey, what is going on there?" So this hits you close at home, let's say. I believe though, and again, outsider's perspective, I believe though he was pointing primarily at illegal immigration, right, and not legal immigration. Is that correct?
You can point and act in very different ways, right? We can look at Rameda Ozturk, we can look at Mahmoud Khalil, we can look at just one of my own students, right, who was coming back from France and was, held by ICE, for hours longer than their typical travel from France to the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And so in this, right, the rhetoric to obviously convince people is, the sort of like, oh, we're only going to go after the baddies.
Right.
But
Yeah.
really, ideologically, if you look at just, other things that Trump has said about like, going after, civil illegal immigrants and, this stuff has occurred. So there is a general sentiment against certain forms of immigration, to put it lightly. And so in that sort of regard, right, the rhetoric has gone beyond, one, the illegal immigrants in the United States, and number two, right, that sort of rhetoric was to allow an entry point for undesirable individuals, according to present American fascists, to go after. And so in this particular regard, right, what we end up with having here is really sort of an act of deception. You'll have fascists use the tactic of postmodernism, but really towards some truth. Oh, we need to make America great. What's one of the ways we can make it great? Oh, well, we need true Americans, quote unquote, living here.
Mm-hmm. Whatever true Americans means.
Right. Which at the end of the day, right, we can look at the Trump administration, right? There are individuals who are women, black, right? Like, to say that sort of the Trump regime is a sort of racist group, yes and no at the same time. It's very bizarre who is, inculcated. But the point at hand being is that the idea here, nonetheless, right, are still targeting tons of individuals who are innocent, right? Getting rid of work visas,
Right.
that were put down, going after individuals in Springfield, Ohio, saying that Haitians are eating, cats and dogs. And as someone with, Haitian friends and members of my family, that one was very concerning, to say the least. And we can see this also expanding to Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s like autism registry, right? These concerning things where more and more individuals become targets. Where does that lead actionably? Cannot objectively say. But this is the thing where it's like, oh, true Americans, think in a certain way, present in a certain way, act in a certain way, right? It is the actionable marginalization again and again and again.
Yeah. So with these kind of ideas and in general, I So personally, I would not look to either the left or the right for answers about what is true. What I would try to do, and what I'm gonna do, what I'm also trying to do in this conversation with you, is I'm trying to ask questions to properly understand the different sides in this conversation, and then try to derive, yeah, let's say not even absolute truth, but try to derive some form of truth from that. From my perspective, it makes sense what you're saying to a certain degree, I think. And maybe I'm misrepresenting you. If I don't understand you correctly, feel free to jump in. That's perfectly fine. But that said, regarding the immigration policy itself, the primary concern that was brought forward, and that was also that's also what I saw happening during that campaign, was that there was a lot of illegal immigration going on, with immigrants coming into the country, into the United States, not through the proper channels, but through other ways, whether it's buses, through the canals, whatever. And they were causing problems, they were causing trouble, they were taking opportunities away from the Americans that were legally in the country, either as citizens or either as legal people in some other capacity. And the idea there was, I think, to get the illegals that were causing trouble out and to say to them, hey, you're more than welcome to come into the country, but you have to go through the proper channels, because we have to process, we have to know where you're coming from, we have to know what your intention is, we have to know what your skills are, all these sorts of things, so that we can gauge if you are good enough, I suppose, to be a United States citizen. Again, not the legal immigration. So I think that if people went through the proper channels and became legal citizens, I don't believe that's I don't believe, not in the absolute sense, but I don't think that the administration over there is targeting people that came into the country legally. So, where's that border? What's happening?
Yeah. So I'll put it to you like this. So every administration has vetted and deported individuals who have criminal behaviors, right? This has happened under Biden, Obama, but Trump won, right? That's been a thing. In the United States, border crossing is a civil penalty, not an illegal penalty. Why is it a civil penalty? Well, simply put, right, crossing an arbitrary line alone should not be something that lands you into automatic detention or deportation, because there may be many valid reasons for someone to flee their given country and enter the United States, admittedly through the improper channels, thus why it is still a civil charge. Interestingly enough, the vast majority of illegal immigration is actually through the airplane system. It is people flying into the United States and overstaying visas. And so in this regard, though, the United States actually has a really strong green card system, right? Not to say that it's easy. The hard part of the system is that, for example, one of my close friends is married a guy from Venezuela. They've been married for a little bit now, and he's been working in the United States for over a decade consistently, paying taxes, all that sort of stuff, married to an Americana who's a PhD student, right? Like doing all the proper stuff, still cannot get his citizenry. So we have an interesting system in the States where it's actually very easy to get vetted, very easy to get incorporated into the green card system, visa system relatively. But that citizenry step is very difficult in the United States. And so in that sort of thing, right, we actually have a lot of statistics as a result about migrant crime and, migrant activity. This isn't to say that no person that has crossed a border has ever committed a crime. That would be absurd, right? That would be like saying no American has ever committed a crime, right? But we have the tools and infrastructure to go after criminality, whether it be from citizens, non-citizens, etc. And what we see statistically is actually lower crime rates amongst immigrant populations. And this makes a lot of logical sense because you're in a country that's not your own. you may have a likeliness of fleeing your own home country. My own family is an example of this. So why would you want to commit a crime and risk being sent back to, in my own family's case, communist Cuba, in some other migrants' case, right, like El Salvador, and be, threatened by a gang? And so in all of this, right, yes, is there issues with high levels of migration? Of course, right? This isn't unfounded. However, the issues largely at hand aren't even necessarily even taking away jobs. A lot of migrant work isn't, quote unquote, literally stealing jobs, it seems. There's a lot of kind of evidence that a lot of, migrant populations will take on jobs that, the vast majority of Americans just are not interested in and will not go about. We can think of agricultural work as an example, a lot of that down in Homestead where I live. So yeah, I think in that sort of regard, this using of illegal immigrants is largely a seeming scapegoat based upon going way back, the what seemed to be the more correspondent to reality narrative, would seem to be the truth of the matter. Again, this isn't to say that there is, zero concern going on here. It's not like, everyone who crosses an arbitrary line is a good person. This is just to say that in many senses, it appears that illegal immigration has been used as a scapegoat to point, at, certain groups of people as the problem that Americans are facing economically, rather than, a variety of other issues going on.
And what is the solution to this? So, looking at the policy for this, what will be the proper solution to this, you think?
What I think personally would be the proper solution would be something like my grandparents' experience in coming from Cuba. Cubans, amongst pretty much any population in the United States history, receive one of the kind of best, what I could call an immigration package. Basically like expedited through Social Security, a more expedited citizenry process. We actually saw this kind of a similar process happen recently with the 47 Afrikaners who were brought into the United States recently. So I actually think the solution here is sort of an expediting sort of process, right? To inform people, right? To get people kind of linked in through quicker sort of channels, right? To create less civilly illegal channels. At the same time, this doesn't mean open borders, right? That is just not something that the United States, can do. At this present time, we don't have the same benefits of the Schengen area where, there's not the same sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Guarantees of stability by all of our surrounding neighbors. Not to say that Mexico's a nightmare, but there are problems in the Sonora Desert, to say the least, that flood into New Mexico, West Texas, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that regard, right, I cannot give every perfect policy position, but I really do think a combination of not having an open border while also being good with expediting citizenry processes and expediting individuals that can come through here, certainly allowing individuals under DACA who were brought here as little kids, not by their own choice across the border, let that, right, I think the solution here is, if people want to be a part of the national project of the United States and there's no reason not to allow them, let them, right? I think it's as simple as that. While at the same time, rather than having, immigration focused on the bureaucratic particulars on, how long has this person been working, right? They can focus on, criminal activity. They can focus on, why people are trying to cross down south or, have expired visas or et cetera, right? It allows, to kill two birds with one stone. Expediting the process is not just about empathy or, sympathy. It's also the rational position to free up resources to go after the rare but existent problematic elements.
Yeah, so if I summarize it, you're pretty much bringing it back to what we started this conversation with. You have to look at the historical context, you have to look at the context of the people, and you have to look at their stories of the people that came to the Netherlands, to the United States. and then make a decision based on that is proper and that is appropriate for them specifically. Do I have that correctly?
Yeah, right. Like I have three grandparents that came to the United States from other countries, two from Cuba,
Hmm.
escaping the Castro communist regime. The other was born in Estonia. Then Estonia was invaded by the USSR, so
Hmm.
they end up in France, and then France was occupied by the Nazis. So she grew up seeing both sort of extremes. That's a
Right.
hell of a situation. And, at the end of the day, you look at that person and go, hmm, yeah, and she had just recently married my grandfather, a U.S. soldier. So yeah, okay, let that person be a citizen, right? Like, and at the end of the day, what ends up happening is that a lot of individuals who are victims of gang violence, be it in Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, etc., Guatemala, um, you know, that doesn't get seen as like an act of like political fleeing. It doesn't get seen as like the same sort of seriousness of violence as, my white grandparents from Cuba, my white grandmother from Estonia, right? I'm not saying it's always racially involved and motivated, right? We can see this with like the history of like Irish and Italian immigrants in New York City being dismissed at first. I just think the United States, weirdly enough, is it surprisingly xenophobic despite not having a quote unquote true ethnic, racial, cultural identity. Americans are, and I mean this in the best way possible, we're mutts, right? We have people from all around the world. I think is it 15 or 35% of all immigrants right now are in the United States. That's a huge portion of the global immigrant population, right? And that's not even accounting for native slash Indian Americans in the United States. So in this sort of regard, right, the American identity is a postmodern identity, but yet there are people out here that are trying to like push against that and be like, no, there's one end all be all to what America is, which is so strange given, that America is a cavalcade of, even in its inception, immigrants from England, Scotland, Germany, and the forced immigration, to put it lightly, of individuals from West Africa and Madagascar.
What I'm wondering is why societies can move towards ideologies like fascism and Nazism. So, what do you think makes Nazism so attractive to people? Was it simply about hate towards a certain group, or is there something deeper at play?
Let's use a different example before getting into Nazism, because I think it's important to show how fascism can exist in a lot of different areas, not just the par excellence expression of it in Nazism.
Hmm.
Let's look at Trujillo's regime in the Dominican Republic. So, what Trujillo was able to do, right, in the Dominican Republic, even to this day, there are a lot of economic issues. It's getting better right now, but a lot of the issues that stem in the Dominican Republic are very material. Simultaneously, there's a complicated history between the Dominican Republic and Haiti, to say the least. Post Haitian independence, right? The Haitian revolutionaries went into the Spanish side of Hispaniola. And there are still some Dominican sentiments against Haiti, using that as an excuse, and a variety of other things. Dominicans also, by and large, do not view themselves as Afro. Some do, some don't. But like you'll see a lot of individuals who are Dominican, who are clearly like mulatto or mixed, right? There is some Afro in their gene pool, but will largely point to a European slash white ancestry. Not that there's anything inherently wrong with how one self-identifies. However, what Trujillo did was run with these sort of narratives and use them towards their worst instincts. Hey, you're materially struggling. Look at the Haitians. And you are not like the Haitians, right? You are a better class, a better group of people, cough, cough, because of your white race and ancestry.
Mm-hmm.
Trujillo himself would even go about like bleaching his skin, maybe not technically bleaching, but making himself whiter than he was.
Right.
And so in this, right, the fascism and Dominican nationalism arose, right, in a way that Trujillo did not actually fully respond to people's material needs and conditions. Instead, he went, hey, you're experiencing a a sort of a toxin, right? The toxin of Haitianness, right? And that needs to be removed from our society in order for the Dominican Republic to be as great as it can be. And we can see under Trujillo's regime, the deportation and the, killing and the arresting of, many Haitian individuals and lots of anti-Haitian rhetoric that creates problems in the Dominican Republic to this day, right? There are still people who grew up under Trujillo, because it wasn't that long ago, who are still sympathetic to anti-Haitian ideas, right? And these ideas, of course, have spread in the modern Dominican Republic, right? They haven't disappeared. And sometimes, and this is, as a South Floridian, right? I have friends who are Dominican and Haitian who get along there, right? But you can see outside of certain friend groups, like there are still Dominicans and Haitians that will beef in the clubs of Miami or at certain house parties or whatever. So these sorts of, sentiments, right? Like creating an enemy, right? Using sort of an objective truth, right? To get your anger, to get your frustration, to get your worries out. But largely these worries are material, right? It redirects material frustration onto another group that inherently didn't do anything, right? It's not like, anyone living under, Trujillo's regime was also around during the Haitian invasion of Hispaniola, which in some ways was and was not justified. So it's really at the end of the day, yes, there are incidents of like Haitians committing crime. There's instances of clearly Dominican criminality towards Haitians. But at the end of the day, right, the concern that the fascists use, they don't go, hey, there are people who do bad stuff, people who do good stuff from all sorts of backgrounds. Instead, what they do is they villainize a particular group, a particular subset for one to get their anger out on. In Trujillo, it is, Haitians. In Italy, it was socialists. In Nazi Germany, it was Jews, gypsies, individuals with disabilities, and so on.
What does that give them? Why villainize another group? What is the end goal there?
Well, the end goal here is hyper-nationalism. As Mussolini writes, that the nation is not the majority, right? So at the end of the day, it is a means of, substantiating state power to its maximal degree. And the end goal for true ideological fascists are international competition where somebody comes out on top, right? The goal of Mussolini was to have international fascism where every nation competed against every other nation with everything it got, and then one nation stands out on top in the end. And so that's kind of the ideological fascist goal. It's this drive towards like international competition, like let's go, I beat you, right? It's not international cooperation, it's international competition. And in order to do that, right, you need everyone in the nation by and large, to be in line with your ideology. You need the true ideologues. Again, the nation is not the majority. You need people to goose step, towards your ends of how you envision the state, the nation, etc., towards beating out every other nation, state, etc.
Okay, so here's an idea. I think that if you and we work together, we collaborate, I think that together we can do a whole lot more than either of us can alone. Because we're not just putting our brain power together, we're not putting our muscle together, we're not just putting our ideas together. We are pretty much melting everything that we can be together and the combination of those two different things together, which may lead to a whole different result. So collaboration between people, I think, is a wonderful thing, right? And it can do a whole lot of good. So why wouldn't it work on a larger scale? Why wouldn't that work on a country scale, right? If countries collaborate with each other, It sounds to me like they can do a whole lot of beautiful things. So with that in mind, with that context there, why is hyper-nationalism attractive to people? Why do people buy into that?
Well, let's on those questions of competition and cooperation.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I'm personally social democratic in my tendencies. And so, yeah, I very much agree with, cooperation, not just between nations, but even within the members of a nation itself.
Mm-hmm.
There is room, though, in social democracy for healthy competition. Going back to basketball, right? Basketball is a space for healthy competition, right? And that's what social democracy does. It takes the elements of capitalism that work well, but also makes it a healthy competition so people aren't starving under capitalism and its laissez-faire sort of stance. However, right, the question then to be asked then, why is, hyper-nationalism attractive? It's like, well, not everyone shares that mentality, right? There are people, to use a basketball reference, like Draymond Green, who want to just beat up everyone on the court by any means necessary, right? There are people who aren't actually about the spirit of healthy competition. They are about the spirit of competition. And so that is one sort of regard if you're a true ideologue. However, I don't think the vast majority of people who subscribe to fascism are individuals who are true ideologues, right? I don't think even the vast majority of fascists have read Mussolini's The Doctrine of Fascism. The thing that is appealing and attractive is going way back, right? Groceries, material conditions, your, impoverishment, or maybe your lack of comparative social mobility, right? That's usually the most attractive thing. And then there is a figurehead that represents the nation, be it Trujillo, be it Trump, be it Mussolini, be it Hitler, be it Bukele in El Salvador, seems to be going that direction, right? That says, I can fix it. I can solve it. And so that's the main sort of reason. And then, in a tertiary sense, from everything else I've said, there are genuine, just like assholes that hate people, just, not to mince words. There's just people out there who are just, anti-Semitic. There are people out there who are anti-trans. There are people anti-Haitian, anti-Jewish, I said anti-Jewish in two different ways, but you get the point that I'm saying, right? Anti people genuinely exist out there also. But I really just see it in just my own experience, interaction, study, etc. of the sort of that the main sort of driving force is, that material need or want, and people, at a crossroads, and they go down the fascist direction. They go, yes, it is the Haitian taking my money away. It is the Jew taking my money away. It is the trans person taking my money away.
And now they have someone to blame.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So the point that you're trying to make, once again, for Bob and Sarah at home, is not necessarily that societies buy into hyper-nationalism as an ideology, but that hyper-nationalism is being packed up in consumable chunks which are relevant to their lives. So
more often, but not always, there are people who genuinely buy into hyper-nationalism.
Right.
And it was very easy for this to happen in the United States, right? If you've ever seen any South Park or any of the works of Matt Stone and Trey Parker, America, F yeah, like there have always been America, F yeah people out there, right? Like go bald eagles, go. So unfortunately, it wasn't unsurprising, sadly, that the United States went in this direction. So there is hyper-nationalism buy-in for some that can maybe be extra heightened by having a boogeyman, but also there is the boogeyman to hyper-nationalist pipeline simultaneously.
When do you think people realize that they're too far? So what I'm aiming for with that question is there's two things that are coming to mind right now, actually three things. Second World War, right? Where the Nazis or the Germans figured out that what Hitler was doing was not so good after all. The war in Ukraine is another one where you have two very different cultures at the moment colliding with each other. And another one is what's happening in and around the Middle East. these three things, these three events, they seem to contain elements of what you're laying out. So with that component in mind, for the regular citizen, right, who is in, let's say, in Russia or in Ukraine or in Israel or in Gaza or, in one of these environments, when is the point that citizens figure out, hold on a second, the story that we heard might be very different from what we've known until this point? So maybe the best way to approach this with the Second World War, since that is an event that has been in the past, so we can analyze it most accurately.
Yes.
When did people start figuring it out, and why?
I'm actually going to use the example of Japan, which I would argue wasn't a fascist regime during the Second World War due to sort of a putting the energies into the emperor as opposed to the nation. Very technical stuff, but this is also just to say that like fascism is a technical term because I want to make that point. But Japan also works well here because if we look at Japan's actions during World War II, they were absolutely, brutal. I mean, the rape of Nanking as the most prominent example of this.
Yeah.
Right. And so in that regard, though, if you look at Japanese history books, there isn't really much apology for what Japan did. There isn't really much reflection. And you can also see that in some sense with the citizenry even to this day. And so as much as it would be amazing to say that like, aha, yeah, people have an aha eureka moment. Yeah, this occurs sometimes for some people, but also for others, it just never occurs. And it can be made substantially worse when the history carries on, such as when Haitian hate carries on in the Dominican Republic, such as Japan never, apologizing for, its actions in Nanking. I mean, even the United States, right? Like it wasn't until, Joe Biden that there was even any sort of like formal apology towards Indian and Native Americans to any degree for the horrors of like the Indian school, which again, there's a lot more to even point at that the federal government should apologize towards Native and Indian Americans for. And so in this regard, though, there is people who have their eureka moment, and I cannot tell you what gives anyone a particular eureka moment. That is just an individual thing that may get them, right? It may be one law, maybe one action, it may be one personal situation. But what I can tell you is that there is these perpetuations of negative narratives, even if the fascist authoritarian regime slips, right? You go into Russia right now, and there's still a vast number of people who are nostalgic for the USSR. And so in these sorts of regards, right, the way that the history is written, the way people are taught up and educated in certain classes is going to perpetuate their particular viewpoints. And if they grew up thinking that Haitians are bad, the Soviet Union's great, Japan did nothing wrong, there is a likeliness that they will carry that forward. This isn't to say that people are lemmings, but again, that influence can have, a massive impact and a massive ongoing impact to when that kid that was taught that, nothing went wrong in Nanking, then themselves become the history teacher that then teaches nothing went wrong in Nanking. And then boom, that narrative perpetuates.
This is actually a conversation I had recently with a very good friend of mine. And that conversation was about the timeline in which apology or making it right is reasonable to do. And there were a couple of examples there. So okay, so there's two things I will give as examples here. In Netherlands, there is also a history of colonization, right? Netherlands, just
right,
like
Indonesia as a
exactly, yeah, and just like with France, just like with Spain, just like Portugal, the Western Europe, or not even the Western European countries, a couple of European countries have done colonization in the past, and that is many hundreds of years ago. But regardless, it had effects. And those effects, to some degree, are very, very real. The consequence of those effects today are very real. I don't think there's any doubt in that. That makes perfect sense, right? Because every action leads to a consequence into the future, and something as significant as that, 100% it has effect now. But then the thing that was brought forward is whether, in our case, the King of Netherlands or the government of Netherlands should apologize for what happened during that period, which I believe was during the 16th century, 15th, 16th, 17th century, something like that. So that's one. Two, and then I would like to hear what you think about that. So my question is going towards that timeline, right? When do you still apologize? When don't you? How does it work? The second example I can give is South Africa, where I believe, if my memory is not wrong, in 91 or 92, the what was the word?
The Parliament of South Africa issued a formal apology for the actions of apartheid. I believe it was the Parliament who made that.
Yeah, for apartheid. So that before that apology, apartheid was still a thing, and you will literally have things like white beaches where people of color were not allowed, and that was 30 years ago, maybe a little bit more, but around 30 years ago, right? So the point I'm trying to make here is, and that's also the question, is in the South Africa example, it is very reasonable to believe and to think that a lot of people living over there have actively experienced apartheid. They know what it is. They have been living in it, right? But in that Dutch example, that's hundreds of years ago. So let me just ask you the question. In that specific situation, should Netherlands apologize for what has happened back then? Yes or no, and why?
Well, let's not just use the Dutch example with Indonesia as one of many colonies, right?
Yeah.
I don't think this should be a matter of necessarily time scale. And I want to credit the person who stated this idea, but I cannot remember which YouTuber it was. But there was a video I came across that made the argument, one of the best arguments of apology I've seen, and that the apology should be of the formal, continuous government. Oh, no, it was during a live stream I was doing where somebody in the chat brought that up. And in that live stream, the channel's name, Red Judaism, someone brought up the idea that the apology is the continuous government apologizing for a particular set of actions. So let's use Mongolia as an example, right? The current Mongolian government should not apologize for the actions of Genghis Khan. Why? Not because a matter of time scale, but the present Mongolian government is not the continuation of the Mongol Empire, right? The current Iranian government doesn't have to apologize for the actions of the Persian Empire. Now, in the case of the Netherlands, right, while there have been, political changes, right, moving powers away from the king and towards the Dutch parliament, nonetheless, it is still a continuation of the prior government. So it's about the government apologizing for its particular actions, not necessarily the given people. Now, the other important point there is that I believe apology is a meaningless virtue signal. Not that virtue signaling is always bad, but it becomes a meaningless virtue signal unless actions are taken, right? So an apology should also come with a rectification, right? A true apology is a change in action. And it is not anyone apologizing for their particular actions. It's not like, yeah, Jeffrey, you are guilty of Indonesian colonization, which I believe was decolonization of Indonesia in the 50s or 60s. I can't remember, but
something
nonetheless,
like that.
Yeah, it's not your fault. It's like you're not apologizing. It is the government apologizing, and the government using resources that it has likely taken in colonization.
So not the government as a person, but the government as an entity.
Correct. And just eventually, right? There's no proper timescales. Like if you're the continuation and you've committed some BS, right? is the United States, formerly apologizing for slavery something that should happen today and be rectified today? Yes, but it's not about necessarily if it's done today, even if that's ideal. Just do it. Do it when you can. If you are, the continual legacy of your government, that's the best argument I've heard. It's imperfect, but I think it's a useful framework.
I understand it, and this is not something I thought about in this way yet. So the reason why I brought the Dutch example forward is because this specific example, and I bet this goes for any similar example in other countries as well, but this specific example brought a lot forward in terms of emotion and in terms of reaction from the public here in the country. Because one of the first things that you hear, right, is like, why should we as a country apologize for something that has 400 years ago, that nobody alive has ever experienced that, nor their grandparents, nor let's say the last 5 generations, they don't know that. So why should that apology happen then, right? When the perpetrators, the people that were in charge of those conquests, let's say, are no longer alive. But that is the personal question. That is looking at individuals. And what you're laying out, I think, is don't look at individuals. There's no person responsible for it, but there is a legal, not legal maybe, but there's
an entity responsible.
There's an entity responsible for it. Okay, fair enough. Without the element of rectification, what is the purpose of an apology? Is it just to say, hey, we know that this is wrong and we won't do it again? And because we understand what, right now in the time that we live, we understand why that was wrong back in the day. Or is there any other? I'm trying to figure out what the value of doing an apology like that is. What do you think?
Well, okay, so we are both from nations that benefited from colonial projects, right? We are both, citizens of imperfect nations that have done good in the world, right? The Netherlands has contributed to a lot of technological innovation, political innovation, and some, very fun times in Amsterdam. Whereas, right, the United States, for all its imperial history, right, a lot of, expansions of democracy and inventions, and we can cite the good with the bad. However, both of our nations benefited from colonial projects, right? The United States still holds on to the oldest continual colony, that being Puerto Rico, right? Like, it's a very difficult conversation to have with Boricuas, but, the issue at hand here is that, yes, the United States also went about, colonial expansion in, Puerto Rico, for a time in the Philippines. And certainly, I mean, the more than half of the Mexican Empire was snagged from it. And so in this regard, right, the acknowledgement here is a historical acknowledgement of just hey, we're not going to erase our own history, right? We're not going to do the whole Nanking thing where it's no, Nanking never happened. There is no Ba Sing Se, and if you're a fan of Avatar: The Last Airbender, right? It's about preventing that sort of whitewashing of history. So that's an important thing it can do. But it's also that acknowledgement of hey, right? There were material things that happened here, right? The United States is the beneficiary of its colonial project. The Netherlands is, England is, France is, right? There is a reason, by and large, why the historical imperial nations are, typically the wealthiest, right? And we can even look at ones that lost their empire, right? Japan was a colonial nation, still pretty wealthy now, right? There is, exceptions like South Korea, for example. But by and large, right, the reason colonial nations were able to benefit is because we were able to clear out the resources from other nations, right? I mean, just look at how much stuff the United States got from its, crushing of the Mexican Empire, right? There is still usage of, Puerto Rico today, right? And so in that sort of regard too, it's acknowledging not just like, oh, this happened. It's acknowledging that like, because this happened, this shaped our prospective nations, right? Our nations would not exist as they do today without this history. So it's preventing that whitewashing. And it's also to say that like, hey, right, like, yes, it was people 400 years ago who did that, but we as citizens are also the byproduct of, in my case, the Mexican-American War, in your case, Dutch colonization of Indonesia.
I'm still failing to see what the value of that would be. So okay, so in the Dutch example, what good would it do the Netherlands, the Dutch people, or maybe the colonized countries from back in the day, or maybe other parts of the world, if the Netherlands would come out and say, we acknowledge that what happened then was wrong? What is the value of that? And this
Oh,
is not, I'm not asking
yeah,
this
yeah, yeah.
because I'm not
Well,
asking, I just
earlier,
want to make this absolutely clear that I
yes.
don't ask this because I don't see the value in it. I'm asking this because I'm legitimately curious how, from this specific mindset, you look at
Yeah,
this.
yeah, yeah. Well, now that you say it like that, because you said
Hmm.
the first time you asked the question, you said without rectification.
Yes.
And earlier I kind of pointed to that, like, yeah, I think this stuff is largely valueless without rectification, right? The main value that it gives without rectification is just that acknowledgement, that prevention of, whitewashing history, disappearing history. That's the only value it has if there is no rectification. So I do believe that like you need both, right? You need to both rectify the history and do something about it, right? There have been political and social change, well, not as needed social changes in South Africa, but certainly political changes, right? I think God, there are still issues with the United States and its relationship to the various Indian nations, but nonetheless, right, there have been improvements over time, including a recent Supreme Court hearing in Oklahoma that went well. And so, in these sorts of regards, yeah, I think I'm with you, where it's like the acknowledgement only goes so far as just a restating of like what's already in the history books. It's just a reconfirmation that like we're not disappearing this history, we're not whitewashing it, we're not going to pretend like it doesn't happen. But really, I think that rectification is an essential element. Now, it's also the most difficult element because how do you rectify these things from so long, ago, right? Is there any fair or proper way to go about these things? And the problem is, when I say this, right, it's going to exist in a very different context for reparations in the United States, right? Something promised by the federal government, the whole famous 40 acres and a mule. That's a very different thing than being like, oh, well, the Dutch king changed and then there was this colonization. Then we stuck like, what aspect for Dutch Indonesian history do you apologize for? The time of the monarch, right before recent decolonization? Like what, like, do we account for all 400 years? Like who, like what aspects, what do we, and so
Hmm.
yeah, it's not the rectification is the necessary part, but the most difficult part, and it's very contextual to a given nation, its history, its relative resources. It's there's so much depth there that that I personally cannot give in each and every apologetic context.
But this is also where the story gets very tough, I think, because now the question that's laying on the table is, okay, if you want to go forward with rectifying, if that's the decision that you're making, and if that's the agreement that you're making also with the other party, then, okay, how much? How do you rectify? What kind of resource will you use? What kind of changes happen? Do we give, what kind of land switches happen? What is that rectification exactly?
And does the rectified even necessarily like not deserve it, more or less, but like, is it actually fair or even proper justice for a great, just, depending on a given situation, great, grandchild of a given crime to receive something for that crime, right? This is where legality almost becomes metaphysical. And for me, I think the best way to rectify is not even though I'm a social democrat and do believe in like social services and providing like direct funds and direct resources to people, oddly enough, in the rectification sort of area, I don't necessarily think it should be a sort of direct handout of money in each and every case. I think it comes to like, legal changes, be it in zoning, be it in tax cuts, be it in other sorts of, sort of benefits that are universal towards poverty. And the reason I say that is in regards of like, what is the true consequence of colonialism? Well, the true consequence of colonialism is that people have their lives upended, their cultures upended. And so what do you do in response? Okay, you can open up cultural centers, right? That could benefit, well, everybody, members in and outside of that community, right? You can offer certain land breaks, social services, right? That they universalize and make sure that like, look, we're doing these things as a rectification of past injustices. But simultaneously, we want to move forward together to benefit all people, all individuals, right? That this is something that we have to do collectively. And I think universalizing, an expansion of social services and resources, cultural centers, etc., is the fairest way to do it, in the sense that like, hey, you're not like picking and choosing certain citizens to receive a privilege above others. You're basically saying, hey, we're doing this because of this, right? This is our motivation, but, right, we want to rectify injustices by and large upon people. Because oftentimes when the people that need those universal services also just so happen to be from minoritized groups and individuals.
Right. It sounds to me like there's an assumption in here, though, and I do want to point that out because I want to know what you think about it. Let me give you a murder case as an example. Weird case, but I will draw a parallel here. So if we consider a murder case where someone murdered someone else, and the parents of the victim are in court, while judgment is being passed by the judge onto the perpetrator. Let's say the judge says 20 years in prison for this. Maybe 25 years in prison for this. In the mind of the parents, nothing is ever enough, right? The guy should burn for eternity. He should be in prison for a lifetime. He should never see the day of light again. 100%. That's not even an assumption. 100% that's the thing that the parents are thinking. So, the parallel here, I think, is that there's an assumption of what the victimized party wants. So, in this specific assumption, the judge symbolizes the law, which is in this case the formula that decides what that rectification looks like. So if we discuss with each other, okay, so if we come to the, let's just play this out. If we come to the conclusion that we want to do rectification with countries that have been colonized in the past, and we decide on a formula what we think is fair for those rectifications, whatever it may be a lump sum of money, maybe community centers, maybe whatever that is. Who says that the receiving party, the victimized party, between quotation marks, thinks that is enough? And if that is not the case, when is it ever enough? Because this to me sounds like something that can be exploited, right? Because if there's a party that is quote unquote victimized and leverages that position, they can get infinite benefit because else they claim victimhood. How do you solve that?
Well, that's the kind of, to start with your last point, that's why I think these things should be universalized. So that way there isn't groups of privilege, right? Like if you, again, are creating these services like universal, right? Like, hey, like we're going to, like we need to rectify material gaps, resource gaps, income gaps as a result of colonization, right? We're going to make these services universal, and it's just going to happen to help the people that are largely victimized, but also people that continue to struggle now, right? True rectification in my book is cosmopolitan. It's moving forward together. Now, is this perfect? No. By no means. As you said with the parents, right, there may be someone who wants more, someone who wants something specific. Ultimately, right, I make these statements about universalizability out of speaking with, minority communities. I am in South Florida. Technically, I'm a member of the minority community as a Cuban and descent in the United States. But that being stated, right, the thing that occurs is, yes, you want to have discussions with the population that was, victimized, or the ancestry of have the ancestry that matches those who were victimized, of course, right? These shouldn't be just like, yes, the federal government's going to make a decision, alone. The president's going to make a decision alone, like, God, what's been happening a lot. But not going into that, right? The point at hand being is like, yes, these things should be done in conversation with these communities. For sure, I think they should be universalized to, get as close to fairness as possible, and to sort of prevent like the whole sort of like groups of privilege versus, asking for more than, between one group versus others, while in conversation with these groups.
Yeah.
However, you are completely correct that we cannot overcome the assumption, that at the end of the day, it will be parties that have relation to the victimizers that will be making the decision. And that's the unfortunate part of all of this, right? Even if, the United States does a bunch of rectifying actions with the Philippines, with Mexico, with, African American and Black individuals, with Puerto Rico, right? At the end of the day, that will be a decision made largely by white America. And these rectifications cannot metaphysically or essentially ever pay enough. And so I really do think, right, in all of this, though, the best thing to do is to help individuals who are struggling move forward, right? To help out all people who have been, products of bullshit, to put it lightly.
You used the F-bomb, the word fair. You said, let's get as close as possible to fairness. And this is kind of a repetition from the question I asked earlier. In social settings, if two people are talking with each other, one might say, that's not fair, right? It's like one of these things. Fair. What is fair? What you might find fair, I don't find fair. What are we talking about?
Uh-huh.
And it's very subjective.
Yes.
Right? The idea of fairness is not objective. There's no answer to that, because what I might find fair, you might not, and vice versa. So once again, I have two questions here, and let's end with this one. How do we get as close to fair as possible? How do we know that universal formula that you want to set up works for all the parties involved? And what do we do if that doesn't? What do we do if there are parties out there, whether that is, in this case, countries or people or individuals or whatever, that feel that have been victimized, but that feel that either the current situation or the proposed rectification isn't fair? How do we deal with that? Because if we think, right, from our perspective, if we think that the offer that we are making is fair,
Mm-hmm.
then the assumption in there is, of course, that the other party also finds that fair. But if we bring something forward that somehow universally we think this is a fair package, this is what we're gonna do, and the victimized parties say, not gonna happen, this is not fair. How do you end that? Because once again, this brings opportunity for exploitation.
No, and that's why I say as close to fairness as possible, right? There is no universal fair. It is very subjective. And so when I'm thinking of fair, right, I am thinking of it in a very John Rawls sense, where for him, fair is a, minimum living standard, a minimum level of caretaking. But again, that understanding of fair from Rawls and, as I put forth, of course, is not going to be universal. It's not going to be viewed subjectively. And so that's why it's always as close to fair. For me, fairness is not an objective principle. It's, a guiding star type of thing, right? In this sort of scenario where fairness would be a guiding principle in the same way justice is a guiding principle, right? We can't have objective justice, but we can use that as a guiding star, right? Liberty as a guiding star, freedom as a guiding star, because these are abstract notions ultimately. And so, yeah, I think that's the problem at hand that you put well. There is no universal correct thing. Some parties will be satisfied, some parties won't. That's our postmodern state of things. But I do think it's working in collaboration to get towards the guiding star of fairness. And again, rectification doesn't have to just be like one time, like that's it, that's the one time we're rectifying. You can apologize for the same incident multiple times in your daily life, right? Like you could have apologized in the moment, let's say for, driving your friend home drunk, just to use an example. And then like 10 years later, hey man, I'm still sorry about that, right? Like, you know what I mean? It's not like, oh, that's it, one time and we never have to again.
Yeah.
No, this could, actions towards fairness, towards justice, towards liberty, towards freedom, towards love, can be done multiple times, reiterated, re-emphasized, reworked, retooled. It doesn't just have to be like, all right, that's it, we're good.
Yeah. The problem is here. So if you and I, if we are in a conflict with each other, or not even in a conflict, you and I, we want to collaborate with each other. Right? We can together work towards something that is fair, right? Because we can negotiate with each other. So I can try to probe what you find important. You can try to probe what I find important, or I put it forward myself, just like you can put it forward yourself. We communicate, we collaborate when we find common ground, and we go from there, right? We find out what the things are that are inhibiting you or inhibiting me, take those out. And then in the end, we should come to a conclusion that to you feels fair, to me feels fair, and makes us both better. And that, I think, is the best possible outcome of a collaboration or negotiation, however you want to call it. So that you could define that as the objective fair between us two, right? Because we can figure out what our objective fair is. But objective fairness, like you said, doesn't exist on the scale that we are talking about, because it's just too complex. There are too many parties with too many. Every single party that you add to this equation, now it's just us two, but every party that you add makes it that much more complex.
Yep.
And you use the analogy of the guiding star, but that's what I'm trying to think about how that would look, because the guiding star is something that objectively exists. You can look into the sky and you can see it. That thing objectively exists. It's non-negotiable. You and I both look at it and we can draw the exact same conclusion where it is. But objective fairness doesn't exist. So how can we aim towards? How can we try to come as close to fairness as possible when we can't define fairness?
Yeah. Well, I think that's the question. Like I don't have anything else to add to that, right? It would be that confluence of, because it would be the exact same structure, just multiplied. And yes, when you multiply it, it gets more complicated, and that guiding star becomes fuzzier or wider, or, starts existing in multiple places. So yeah, I think, I actually completely agree with that. So the structure is the same between two people. And it's working towards an abstraction, right? It's working towards an abstract sort of quote unquote truth here, right? The truth of fairness, the truth of justice, the truth of love, right? But again, people figure out these things in small scales, large scales. Not that all parties are satisfied, but you can have, consensuses to a degree, compromise to a degree, right? We just see this happening. Like, oh, how do we figure out if things are fair? We just do, right? Like that's just something we observe. And there's never been an objective fairness, an objective love, an objective justice, but there are things that are, appealing to a consensus. And that doesn't mean the consensus should always, dictate the terms, right? There is room for, civil disobedience, and the consideration of minorities is also as stated by Ayn Rand, is also massively important. So yeah, I mean, you're nailing the problem on the head, But rather than like just be like, oh, defeatist about it, it's like, no, we do these things happen, right? Like working towards some general sense of fairness does happen, working towards
Hmm.
some general sense of understanding, betterment, improvement, right? These things are just observable occurrences, right? We can see this in one-to-one interaction, in a 1-to-5 interaction, on a city scale, a state scale, a national scale, etc. of these sorts.
That makes sense. And maybe this ties into the beginning of the story. And I think we have a circle over here because we started this conversation by talking about meta narratives, about big stories, and that the postmodernist way to look at the world is to say there is no one true story that should rule them all, because you should look at the context. You should take individuals into account, individual stories, that is. And that works when we are trying to figure each other out, when you and I are in a negotiation with each other about something, or when we're trying to figure out a specific conflict between two countries or whatever. But when we ask ourselves the question, what is fairness, and how can we define that formula that is as close to fair as possible in order to solve all of this that we just talked about? Maybe that, and feel free to jump in, but maybe that is where one of these meta narratives, one of these big stories comes in. Because then you could say, okay, how can we define what is fair to humanity? Not to specific countries, not to specific ideologies, not to specific societies, to humanity in general. And maybe then you can look at things like Christianity or other religions and say, this is a framework in which that question can be answered.
Yeah, that's why meta narratives exist. They're useful. Like they provide a solution to something. The issue at hand is that there is no such thing as a universal meta narrative, right? So that's the issue
Mm-hmm.
at hand. But yeah, meta narratives are super useful. Like, and I'm not saying I'm like free of, meta narratives. I literally, every time I teach my students, I literally have a bias statement that includes the fact that I have biases and I'm never going to grade against somebody else for disagreeing with me, for having different biases, for having different outlooks, right? So I think it's an important thing to acknowledge those like narratives that we have. And I think
Yeah, for sure.
postmodernism has helped me out with that. So yeah, this isn't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily like I guess I would call myself a postmodern thinker by and large. But I think part of being postmodern is also being like, yeah, like meta narratives have a usefulness. Like Christianity has served a lot of people well. Like look at a lot of inmates who have improved their lives after conversion to Christianity or Islam, for example. And in that same, sort of vein though, right? Like that isn't just the sole domain of like Christianity or Islam, right? So it is that sort of thing. We're having the Platonic meta narrative, like this is the essence of fairness, this is the
Mm-hmm.
essence of love, this is the essence of justice, is so useful, is so, tempting. But I think simultaneously, you know, uh, if we have meta narratives, right, our idea of fairness could end up imposing on somebody else's idea of fairness. And I think having room for compromise and working things out and not being beholden to one's meta narrative outright is an important and useful thing to do in discussion, and even just coming up with like a narrative for the time being. As a philosopher, I get into a lot of discussions about definitions. And as you can tell by my tendencies, I try to avoid them. Definitions are useful, they're needed, they're necessary. But oftentimes, and a lot of my philosophical peers make fun of me for this, that I will concede to my opponent however they want to define a given idea. Because for me, I think it's more important to understand how somebody else is approaching a given idea, a given topic, a given understanding,
Mm-hmm.
and where can I improve my understanding of what fairness, justice, love, goodness is as a result. So yeah, I guess to answer your question, meta narratives are useful, but ironically aren't the end all, be all of a given topic.
Fair enough. I love this conversation with you.
I had a great
I
time.
I think I have one or two more questions for you,
Of course.
and these are personal ones. What is your personal hope for our future?
Wow. I mean, to put it simply, man, I just want people to get along to the best of our abilities, man. I'm very live and let live, and so I just want to see a lot more of that. And my biggest concern surrounding kind of fascism and is that sort of the prevention of live and let living. Not that there aren't other ideologies that do that, but I think fascism certainly gets in the way of that. And so anything that prevents, live and let live is something I want to see pushed out.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, my hope is live and let live. We improve our technology, we improve in our kindness and helpfulness to one another. So, yeah, very kind of soy boy liberal answer on my end. But hey, man, I know what I am.
Hey, fair enough. Fair enough. Is there anything that we left undiscussed that you want to bring forward, or that you feel that everybody who is watching and listening right now should absolutely know or understand?
Whoa. I mean, there's a lot of things that it would be nice for people to understand, but I think at the end of the day, if there is something to be understood on the main topic of today about, postmodernism, um, you know, one of the useful things about postmodernism is the way in which it can be adopting of other, sort of ideas and other sorts of notions. And so I think for me, something that people should know is just knowing, right? That sort of just like coming to know and coming to understand, doesn't necessarily hurt, right? There are some times where like, being overly, academic and being bound to a model is going to make one an idiot. And so instead of being like model bound in all instantiations, think about how your knowledge has utility. Think about what your knowledge, serves not just yourself, but serves others. And just, be careful about teching your knowledge. Not that there's no room for useless knowledge, quote unquote, but I think it's always important to not just be like, a Jeopardy contestant and know all the random answers, but also to figure out like how your knowledge can, benefit your community. Can it benefit, individuals in need? Can it benefit your friends, your family, etc. of the sort? I think is always an important thing to know and check.
Beautiful. Anthony, thank you very much.
No, thank you, Jeffrey. It was amazing being on.
Take care of yourself.
Take care.